morning to everyone that's here this morning and to anyone participating online. Today we are going to be deconstructing New Thought. And New Thought is a movement that Unity is a part of. And this is a third part in a series on the deconstruction movement and what deconstruction is. And this was by far the most difficult for me to put together because I am New Thought. And I tend to agree with many of the principles. I wouldn't say all, like when I read Charles and Myrtle, I often say I agree with about 60% of what they say. And I think that's just because we've evolved as a species, and some of what they've said, was really cutting edge at their time and probably not so much at our time. So, but before we just jump right into this topic, I do want to take a moment and just to kind of get us centered. And so if you feel comfortable, close your eyes and just take a deep breath in. And then exhale. A deep breath in. And exhale. And we just open ourselves up to wisdom and understanding regarding New Thought and regarding spiritual tradition. And take a deep breath. And as you exhale, just relax. All right, we can get started. So if you do have a question and you're in the audience, please raise your hand, like she said, so that the microphone can go to you, so that the people that are joining us online can hear. And we'll go ahead and get started just by defining what New Thought is. And so I have three definitions here, one from our movement, one from Ernest Holmes, which was Church of Religious Science and Centers for Spiritual Living. And then the first one is just from the Encyclopedia Britannica. So it's a mind-healing movement based on religious and metaphysical presuppositions that originated in the United States in the 19th century. The next definition I have is from The Revealing Word, which was written by Charles Fillmore. Charles Fillmore is one of the co-founders of Unity. And he defined New Thought as a mental system that holds man as being one with God, or one with good, through the power of constructive thinking. And then this says Charles Fillmore, but, did I repeat the slide? I think I just repeated the slide. Yeah, so this is Ernest Holmes. So that doesn't look right. So Ernest Holmes started the Church of Religious Science, which ended up being now what is called Centers for Spiritual Living. And his definition is a bit longer. New Thought for him was a system of thought which affirms unity of God with man, the perfection of all life, and the immortality and eternality of the individual soul forever expanding. And then so that sounds a lot like Charles Fillmore. And then he expanded on this and says the conscious use of laws of thought for the purpose of producing betterment in one's life or the lives of others. And so he kind of expanded on the definition of New Thought. And how many people in the audience know a lot about New Thought and would consider themselves New Thought? Okay, so there's quite a few people that identify with this particular definition. So when I decided to deconstruct New Thought, normally when you're deconstructing, you take a piece of literature, you take a quote, and then you kind of tear that apart. But I actually split it up into two categories. So we have individual personalized New Thought, so practicing principles as an individual. But then also I wanted to talk a little bit about the institutionalized New Thought. So Centers for Spiritual Living, Unity, Science of Mind, trying to think of, Church of Religious Science, Christian Science, all of those institutionalized movements that originated, because there could be criticism in that. And part of deconstruction is to identify systems that were built from a thought. So systems that were built from a piece of literature. So I do want to go into just briefly, because there's a lot of people here and maybe joining us online that did not join us for the first two talks where we kind of established what deconstruction is. So keep in mind that the deconstruction, The deconstruction does not attempt to prove any fundamental truth, but rather it represents an ongoing process of questioning. The goal is not to disprove, but to analyze the text and subsequent systems associated with the text. So we're not really trying to we're just really figuring out and weighing things in balance when we're deconstructing. We're not really trying to construct anything. And originally, almost every New Thought movement was a deconstruction movement, where they were just negotiating with the text. And every movement, when it comes to spiritual or religious, tends to be about negotiating with certain texts. For example, Charles Fillmore and Myrtle Fillmore was about negotiating with the Bible, along with a lot of Eastern influences, Eastern religious influences, and the influences of the Transcendentalists. And then also keep in mind, because a lot of people raise their hand, yes, we identify as New Thought, that deconstruction is not about criticizing or judging. That's not the goal. Even though we are going to be using critical language and critical thinking, the goal really isn't to, or the goal here is not to deconstruct the topic of New Thought, or the goal is to just deconstruct the topic of New Thought, not to criticize the movement or criticize the institutions, because we are going to talk about both things. And so the first thing, does anybody have any comments or questions at this point? All right. So probably when we get into specific topics, it will be more relatable. So the first topic that I wanted to talk about was about spiritual bypassing. And so spiritual bypassing is a tendency to use spiritual ideas or practices to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, such as psychological wounds or unfinished developmental tasks. The term was introduced in the mid-1980s by John Wellwood, a Buddhist teacher and psychotherapist. And so, does anybody have any comments on spiritual bypassing? I do know that this is one of the criticisms that people have when we're discussing New Thought, simply because there is sometimes the idea that we can just affirm past an experience, where we're trying to cover up an experience using affirmations or even denials. In Unity, we talk about both denials and affirmations. But denial, when we're using a denial, it's not about denying what's real. We're not denying that something is real. We're denying that certain aspects of a situation, we're denying that they would have power over us. And so, yeah, go ahead.
So, would you say that spiritual bypassing is more of a conscious or a unconscious thing that people do?
Oh, I would say it's unconscious. I would say that people want to avoid, for example, if somebody is experiencing grief, well, there's certainly a natural process associated with grief. And I do think that somebody could pick up spiritual principle or spiritual and assume that, I can just avoid this by affirming it away. Try attempting to just overshadow the natural process of grief by using certain New Thought or spiritual principles. Does that make sense? Anybody else have a comment or question?
It could probably be both.
What? Can you?
Unconscious to, I can speak loud enough.
No,
well, not for the people online.
You can't hear online.
On the computer, people online.
I feel it could be both. Unconscious, like you're burying stuff emotionally, until then it comes to your conscious mind, then it becomes conscious.
Yeah.
So it could be both at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could consciously want to avoid pain for sure. I know I have done that, and I've also used New Thought principles to try to avoid it.
It's like when people say good vibes only.
Right.
I'm not going to be negative.
Right.
Only good vibes, only positive.
Yeah. Yeah, I love those people, but I also, first of all, I don't derive a lot of value and meaning from those types of exchanges, because that can be really toxic and really dangerous. If you're really just trying, and our natural state of being when it comes to New Thought is love and joy and peace. That is our natural, that is our, in some traditions they say that's our natural inheritance. That's where we're supposed to live. But with spiritual bypassing, we can certainly attempt to ignore what is real. Go ahead, Bobby.
So, in order for okay, you can go both ways. If you want to always focus on the negative, that's toxic.
Mm-hmm.
But if you only focus on the positive, it can actually be toxic as well. You have to allow things to resurface so that you deal with it. You can't just keep burying things because they'll always come up.
Mm-hmm.
Even if I'm like, oh, good vibes. Okay, maybe those things came up for a reason instead of burying it like, oh, that's bad juju or whatever. It's coming back up. Okay, it's time to deal with it.
Yeah. I know for me and my healing journey, I was introduced to New Thought and then I started doing therapy. And I really tried to ignore a lot of what I was going through. And I remember when my therapist, who was also New Thought, said, well, have you really given yourself permission to be hysterical? Because what you're telling me, these experiences, these are reasons to be hysterical.
Right.
Yeah. And she had a punching bag in her basement. She said, why don't we just do a few sessions of you just really being hysterical? And what was going on is I had trauma in my body and I had trauma in my emotions, and I was just trying to pretend like it wasn't there, and I wasn't, and it was really having an effect on my body. So yeah, go ahead, Elby.
Wendy had.
Hello?
You're there.
Wendy has a story that she tells that she was raised with incredible trauma. And she would not let herself feel rage.
Mm.
And she went to a therapist. I know him. He used to be here. And he told her that she needed to experience rage. And her reaction was like, no, because she thought he had to teach her the difference between experiencing a feeling and acting out of it. Because she always felt that if she allowed herself to feel it, that she would act on it. Mm-hmm. And he showed her that there's a difference between feeling and experiencing and acting out. And when she allowed herself to do that, it was like a rebirth. I mean, she went through just amazing freedom. So part of it is understanding how you deal with things.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think in New Thought, finding healthy ways to process our emotions, like rage or anger or hysteria, or things that were, if I go there, what if I never get back out? I can promise you, if you've never went there, first of all, get a really good therapist. I highly recommend a good therapist. But yeah, get a really good therapist. But you allowing yourself to go there, like I've worked with people who have intense grief. They've just never allowed themselves to go there, and it has compounded over time. And they're afraid that if they go there, they will just be stuck there forever. But when you do allow yourself to go there with the proper channels, that's why I think therapists, we have a lot of good resources in New Thought. There are a lot of good complementary healing modalities that help people process these things. But yeah, so we definitely don't want to use New Thought to just bypass. I did have a quote, because we are trying to take a critical look at the text when we're doing deconstruction. So here's a quote with Charles Fulmer. In divine mind, there is no recognition of evil conditions. Such conditions have no bias of reality. To rid ourselves of any appearance of evil, let us change our thought at once and begin to build consciousness that knows nothing but good. And we could certainly and easily take that and just try to ignore the world away. We'll be talking about that a little bit later. But does anybody have any comments or questions on that quote? I think we kind of already talked about it. So the next kind of topic that I think is common and is an appropriate criticism, and again, critical thinking, not criticism as though it's bad. But another topic for New Thought would be what's called New Age guilt. And this is Louise Hay said, no matter what the problem is, our experiences are just the effects of our inner thoughts, which can be true, but it can also be very easy for us to start going, I'm having this negative experience. How did I create this? And how do I, and feel guilt about that? And so that is often coined as New Age guilt. Has anybody ever felt that?
Has anybody ever not felt it?
Right, I was shocked. I'm like, wow, 3 people and me? My goodness. And I think that sometimes too, at least for me, like trying to constantly figure out why I'm experiencing something. I actually, over the years, I've developed this kind of universal denial and affirmation that I'm willing to release whatever pattern is in my consciousness that's created or that contributed to this condition or experience. That's the one I use. Because I think that sometimes just trying to figure out the initial cause can create challenges as well. Go ahead.
I think interpretation has a lot to do with me coping with that.
Yeah.
Because that's definitely something I've had an experience with. And it's just like, this is what in my head I interpreted as what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody else's perception might be completely different. And the conversation in my head can go towards negative. But if I stay present in this moment and realize that that stress is not there, that situation is not there, that can be helpful.
Yeah. So, and next week I'm actually doing a series about Louise Hay and her 12 steps to loving yourself, or 12 keys to loving yourself. And one of them she really talks about is blame. And there's a big difference between blame and responsibility. Guilt comes from when we're blaming ourselves for something that happens, whereas responsibility is our ability to respond to whatever situation that we're in. One disempowers and the other empowers. So the next one, which I personally feel is really big in Unity, and I have not noticed it as much in other traditions, is the Jesus Christ Superstar Syndrome. Jesus. Okay, so this is from a quote from Truth Unity, Seeking Unity. Jesus is our brother and the first fully expressed Christ within. We are all capable of this, if only we would try, is what it says. And that's from Seeking Unity. And as far as I'm concerned, this is an unreasonable comparison between a myth, a mythological figure, and who we are as people. And I'm not saying Jesus is a myth as though he didn't exist, but we are doing a class every Sunday, or not a class, a spirit group every Sunday, where we're talking about cultural influences that created the Bible. And one of the cultural influences is that the Semitic people groups had a tendency when they were writing things down to elevate certain aspects of the text, to mythologize within the text. So, and it's not, so we would consider that as lying, but they didn't consider it lying. They were just elevating the text. They were expanding on an event, and they created myths out of actual things. And so when we do this, and I've heard so many people within Unity that have there's almost this constant comparison that Jesus is the ideal, that's what you're striving for. And what I personally think that can do is it can create this tension to where we're never quite good enough. And that's another thing we're going to go into next week is Louise really taught that you are perfect as you are right now. Everybody in this room is perfect as they are. And yes, you can also make changes. You can continually evolve and increase, but you're okay now. Whereas I think that, the Jesus Christ Superstar Syndrome can certainly create a feeling of not being good enough, or that we have to constantly try and strive to be better than perfection, which is what we are. Anybody have a comment or question on that?
Back here.
Okay. Clay's got a question?
David Crockett said you don't let the truth get in the way of a good story.
Right.
He became a congressman.
Yeah.
So, it's kind of easy to embellish.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, in certain cultures, the embellishment of a story wasn't bad. It wasn't looked at as bad, and it was kind of expected. So, you could tell a tall tale, and that was fine within that culture.
So if I could relate a thing,
Yeah.
it seems a little bit like stage actors are required to over-emote and overact to get the point across. And so when you create something ordinary, maybe the point isn't there unless you exaggerate it for the masses,
Right.
we'll say, to get your point across to everyone.
Yeah. Then it looks like Stella, do you have your hand raised? No. No, okay. Clay does.
Yeah, this calls to mind my dad. My dad collected, similar to the author Vance Randolph, he would collect tall tales from this area, and one of them that came to mind was when he spoke to these old men whittling on a porch outside the general store, and they said that they had caught a snake that weighed 100. They weighed it, and it weighed 120 pounds. And my dad challenged me and said, "You sure? Sure, it wasn't 119 pounds?" and they said, "Well, we wouldn't lie for a pound." You know, and again, that illustrates that the embellishment is perfectly fine, because if you're getting your point across, which is to communicate your culture,
right,
and that's the important thing to keep our mind on, not so much and that's what those Semites were doing. It wasn't that they were being criticized for embellishing a little bit, but they were, in my mind, that was misplaced criticism, because all they were doing is trying to put their culture in the forefront, and that's okay.
So in the writing of those texts, there's a lot to understand when we're talking about the writing of those texts. First of all, I do think that they're meant to convey universal spiritual principles when we're talking about the Bible. There's a lot in there. But I also think that it's important to remember that all of the Jesus texts were written after the temple was destroyed. And so they are all apocalyptic texts that are in response to a tragic event that took place. That's why in all of them they are talking about Jesus is coming back, like, soon. And there was an expectation that was going to happen in their lifetime because the temple was destroyed. And now, a lot of people are reading into that without the understanding that all of those texts were written after the temple was already destroyed. So, all right. Any other comments to that particular criticism? No? So the next one that I would say is pretty common, at least for me, is rich people religion. And that phrase, when I was explaining New Thought to a good friend of mine, she said, "Oh, it's rich people religion." And I was like, yeah. And so The Secret, to me, I actually like The Secret. I know there's a lot of criticism within a lot of New Thought communities about The Secret. I think it's a good open door for a lot of people. But I do want to just quote it here, since we are deconstructing. So the difference between someone who is struggling financially and someone who has a fabulous life of wealth comes down to one thing. It is their mindset. And that's from the movie The Secret. And, in that movie, if you watch it, there's a lot of people that talk about how they got their mansion. They just visualized it long enough, and how they, fancy cars and all of that. And Bobby was the one who pointed out in our class last week, or our spirit group last week, that, it's really easy if you have a full bank account to visualize a fancy sports car, right? And that we're not necessarily all starting at the same place. And some aspects of New Thought, I think, can create way more frustration for people than it can alleviate frustration. I know people who are in a constant state of tension because they're constantly trying to manifest their desires, but their experience of life and their desires are so far away from themselves that they're creating for themselves things like depression and anxiety, discord. Discord, all kinds of things. Whereas the goal really with New Thought is not just, I personally don't think it's to manifest our desires. I do think our desires are meant to be manifested, but that is not the purpose of New Thought principles. And if you really think about, the whole manifest our desires, Hitler was able to manifest his desires. Does that necessarily mean it was good?
No.
Right. And I think that with this whole idea that, and there is this portion, certainly not not our community, of course, but there is this portion. Just kidding. There is this portion of New Thought where that is the goal, and it does lean toward the whole rich people religion. And here's the thing: my goal is not to criticize where they're at. My goal is to expose that this is a trend within some of the New Thought system. So, anybody have a comment or question about that? Has anybody ever gotten frustrated because they were trying to manifest something and it just seemed to, create more frustration rather than alleviate it? Yeah.
It seems to me.
Oh, can you? Sorry, you came in a little late. We do need the microphone just so that people can hear online.
So it seems to me everything has to do with spirit, New Age, and spiritual evolution these days. Is when you aspire, it's like feeding. It's some kind of ego. It's almost like it's just as bad as not. I don't even know how to describe it, but I've just been myself. I'll just say that the higher experiences I've had, then when you long for and you're attached to and you desire and you're focused on that, then it's like you're focusing on what you're not, and it's just another ego level of, it's like ego's like tricky business.
Yeah. And I personally don't think that manifesting a nice car or a house, I don't think any of that is bad or wrong at all. I think that there's more to our spiritual development than just getting tangible items,
So if we only aspire to be rich, and then once we get there, are we actually going to be happy?
Right.
You can be happy where you're at. Being rich is not happiness, because we know a lot of people that have all the wealth in the world and can't even find happiness.
Right.
So if your goal is to be happy, just be happy where you're at.
Yeah. And
if you're only aspiring to be rich, you're never going to be happy.
Yeah. You carry your consciousness with you everywhere.
Yeah.
It's like the universe doesn't know your intention all the way through.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's I'll be happy when I get the right job and I get the right house and then the right car and then the right spouse. And here's the thing: people will manifest all those things and be miserable through the entire experience because they're assuming that their happiness, their sense of joy that exists outside of them. It doesn't exist within. Sure, go ahead.
Money can't buy you love. That's what John and Paul said.
Mm-hmm.
The Beatles.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
It's true. Get your steps in.
It's good interaction.
Get your exercise that way.
There's something to be said about evolution, and where does evolution lead us? And so it's a matter of, well, I'm supposed to be doing this with my life, or I want to do this with my life, and then you follow your heart towards a certain goal, but even that is still leaning into something that you're not sure of.
Mm-hmm.
And so that discussion of what is evolution, where are you going, what type of finances will you have in the future, without even holding on to it, it's definitely a confusing, when you don't know, it's just, it is what it is.
Yeah, and actually part of what you're saying, when we're talking about The Secret, I didn't hate The Secret. I think it started some really good conversations. Yeah. And it is a good method for people to plant some seeds, to begin to realize how consciousness really does have an impact on our experience of life. In which I think that the overall message of at least that film, I don't think it's been 10 years since I've seen it, but the overall message of that film was about the experience of life. The film wars, when they talked about it, when they talked about how your thoughts affect your experience of life, that is less of a tangible thing and more of a, what is going on in my experience. And I mean, the Fillmores definitely talked about prosperity. Charles Fillmore said it was a sin to be poor. But you have to look at it from his perspective. He wasn't talking about how much money somebody had in the bank. He wasn't talking about how many houses or how many cars somebody was having. When he said poor, he was talking about a mindset that didn't understand that they were connected to universal source, which would provide them everything that they need. Because to Charles Fillmore, prosperity and abundance was having all that you need, and within this life. That's what that's what it was for the Fillmores. Yeah, go ahead, Albie.
And one of the things that I was reading about the Fillmores, it must have been from Spirits in Rebellion, was that they would know what they were supposed to do next. They might not have the money for it, but it was what they were supposed to do next. So it's what they did, and the money always came in. And as they experienced that flow, they were able to stay in it more because their beliefs changed to being in the flow.
Mm-hmm.
And so they didn't have volumes of money. And when you look at the farm and everything they did at Unity Village and the restaurant, and it was a stepping stone process.
Mm-hmm.
And we are in that same process.
Yeah.
We're evolving toward what our desires are because they're what's expanding the universe and creating eternity.
Yeah.
And so it isn't about having the wealth, it's about having the understanding of who you are and who's backing you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and Charles and Myrtle, when they first came up with the idea of Unity Village and they presented it to the board laughed at them. And one of the board members handed Charles $1 and said, "There you go, that's for your building fund." And Charles said, "Thank you, we have a seed," And so, absolutely, it is an evolution. Using the word again, the evolutionary process. It is an evolutionary process when it comes to consciousness, and we're not really deconstructing New Thought today, I guess, but we're just talking about it, which is good. I kind of thought this may happen, but so and here's another thing that most people don't realize what their desires are. Most people have a false assumption. They're not really, so like, for example, if somebody wants a big house, well, they might really, their actual desire might be stability and security. It may not be a big house. They may get a big house and like, man, this is a lot to clean. And so they may make a false assumption that they desire one thing when it's just a physical symbol of another thing. Same way with a certain type of car. They may desire that, but it could be that they are looking for recognition and status, and that's the actual desire. And so that kind of goes into the same thing. Go ahead.
Could you? Somebody here surely knows the definition of sin is just forgetting or
Missing the mark.
Missing the
Yeah,
mark.
it was an archery term. So the definition of sin, it was an archery term. So when you pulled back and you let go and you were aiming at a target, you didn't hit the target. That's all that sin is. Yeah.
Humans are really, really bad at knowing what they want.
Yeah, it's true.
What did you say, like no experiences?
Huh?
What did you say?
I said humans are really bad at knowing what they want.
What they want to do.
All right, so we'll move on to the next topic here. Ignoring over responding. Now, we kind of talked a little bit about this earlier, but I did want to do this quote and kind of talk about this. So, it is found that by the use of these mind forces, man can dissolve things by denying their existence, and that he can build them up by affirming their presence. This is a simple statement, but when it is applied in all intricate thought forms of the universe, it becomes complex. The law of mental denial and affirmation will prove its truth to all those who persistently make use of it. And that is Charles Fillmore from Christian Healing. This is one thing that I disagree with Charles about. I don't think that ignoring something resolves it. Now, denying that a certain thing can have power over us, that can be powerful. But, whatever we're putting out into the universe does come back to us. That's one of the universal laws. And if we're just putting out, I'm going to ignore this, I'm going to pretend like this isn't happening, I'm going to pretend like this isn't happening, we're only creating more ignorance on this planet. That's all we're doing. And we don't want to get into, because there's a lot going on this planet, particularly just within this past week. Over this past week, the Missouri government created a place where you could report trans individuals, and then they got a little bit of a backlash from that. And so they were like, okay, no, you can report trans centers. Then they got a bit of a backlash from that. And so then a bunch of young people decided to spam it so bad that there was no way for them to analyze the data. And so the government decided to just take it down. So, but here's the thing. If people had just ignored what was taking place, that could set a really dangerous precedent. It actually took people interacting and engaging and stopping it from happening. And if those people would have just ignored it, where would we be now? So, go ahead.
I have a little background of Eastern philosophy. Muji is a person that I've followed, and just an interpretation of man can dissolve things by denying their existence, and that he can build them up by affirming their presence. An interpretation of that to me is that right now in this moment, that situation doesn't exist. It's just a thought in my mind, something that I've imprinted. And by affirming its presence on me is just affirming that it's still inside of me somewhere, and that I can acknowledge that and be patient with it, and understanding that this still lives inside of me somewhere, but that it doesn't actually exist in this moment.
Right. There's also, if we go into metaphysical philosophy, there's two different versions of metaphysics. There's the one that denies that this physical existence is real, and Unity is not one of those. Unity accepts that this physical reality is this is tangible, real stuff, right? Now, the way that metaphysical traditions that deny physical reality, what they say is, well, the only thing that is real is what is eternal. And what isn't eternal isn't really real. But I'm telling you, I don't know if you've ever been through some experiences, but it's, this is a real experience for me, right? This is all really happening. Sometimes I like what it says, what Dumbledore said to Harry Potter when Harry Potter had his near-death experience. Harry said, "Is this real, or is this all happening in my head?" Dumbledore said, "Well, of course it's happening in your head, Harry. Why does that mean it's not real?" And so I do kind of like the perspective of Unity, where this is actually this is real stuff. This is tangible stuff. So yeah, go ahead.
I want to talk a little bit, or at least ask a question and hear your thoughts about when you deny or when you ignore something, you are still acknowledging its existence.
True. That's true.
And so it can't be a thing because you're still dualistic. So there's I guess two types of ignorance, which would be I know this is happening, but I'm choosing to ignore it, which is still giving it the attention that it needs to propagate and exist. Or I would say an extra dimensional or a 90-degree turn of ignorance where it literally doesn't exist. You can't ignore it because it doesn't exist. Right. And so that's kind of be the goal of your consciousness raising, where it's that's why the deny, our language is so inherently limiting. Because we need a term for what is beyond ignorance, beyond that, where if it exists, you can't ignore it. And then, we'll go with that. He said stupidity.
And denial in terms of the Fillmores was like the Great Depression was taking place during the development of the Unity movement, and they denied that the fluctuations within the economy had power over them. So that was the version of denials for the Fillmores. Go ahead.
So growing up, my mom would say, ignorance is not knowing, and stupidity is knowing and still not caring.
Yeah. All right. So we have a few more slides. And do we have the announcements?
Yeah, I got you.
Oh, perfect. Awesome. Yeah. If somebody wants to do those when we're done, that'd be great. All right. So I want to get into institutionalized New Thought. And I talked about the different institutions that are kind of New Thought institutions, Unity being one of them. And this kind of extends into the topic that we were already talking about. Do New Thought principles within institutions of New Thought address the circumstances of the present day is the real question. And the reason why I brought this slide up is because next week I'm talking about Louise Hay, and I'm doing a little bit of a rundown of her history. Now, just briefly, and then we're going to talk about the 12 ways, the 12 keys to loving yourself. But, she spearheaded a lot of the support that people were getting for HIV and AIDS. She created the support groups. People modeled her support groups all over the country. And part of her history is that she was a teacher within the Church of Religious Science. And she ended up finding that being a part of that church was limiting. And so she went rogue and just kind of did her own thing. And why I brought it up here is because I was like, I really don't want to leave Unity out of that conversation that I'm going to have next week. I don't want to leave Unity out of that conversation if they were doing something to respond to that crisis. And so I contacted the archives. At first I started searching for things myself. Then I contacted the archives. And we're talking like this is the 80s, this is recent history. So it's something that should be pretty easy to find. No evidence. Unity had zero response to what was taking place at that time. Now, to me, I was quite disappointed because I was like, I'll find something. I'll find someone that was responding to this nationwide crisis. And instead, they did send me the universal principles that help people with HIV and AIDS, but like knowing the power of people like Marianne Williamson as well was one who had a direct response to what was taking place, in the 80s. And Louise Hay, even within Unity, I was talking to somebody a couple of years ago within Unity and mentioned that Louise Hay is one of my primary New Thought teachers. And they said, at the time, Louise was the only one that could heal HIV and AIDS. I remember going to see, I was a kid in the 80s, so I wasn't going, following her. But at the time, people would go, and she was the only one that could heal that disease. So yeah, I do think that one of the things that is a challenge within the institutions of New Thought is that we have a tendency of just not wanting to see what's going on, or through our own prejudices, just not engaging. Go ahead.
I was honored to be able to travel with Louise Hay, and I was on her team that we got to do all that stuff with all the other authors, like Marianne Williamson, etc.
Yeah.
So it was wonderful. She was really a sincere person.
Oh, yeah, she was.
Yes,
Sure.
yes. Did you meet her too?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so another thing, and this is specific to Unity that I wanted to mention, is disunity as Unity was evolving.
Was she healing physically, medically? When you said she was healing, people said she's the only one healing AIDS. Was she doing that?
At the time in the 80s, yeah, she was the only
doing
one.
it just by spiritual means, or had like how
She did it. She taught people how to heal themselves.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Talk to him.
Does anybody else have a comment to what I just mentioned? We're going to talk a lot about Louise Hay the next 2 weeks, so I don't want to dive too deep into that, but okay, cool. Okay, good. Did you want to say something? Okay, all right. I don't want to stop you from saying something.
No, I'll raise my hand, trust me.
So I find it very ironic that Charles Fillmore landed on the name Unity, because Charles Fillmore, the Global New Thought Association, he kept leaving that association, joining and leaving, and joining, I think 3 times. And then his son also joined and left that as well. And the reason why is because he did not like the way other New Thought people were defining New Thought. So he would go around these conferences and ask people, what do you think New Thought is? And when he disagreed, it'd make him mad. It's like, and I find that quite ironic. And this goes into, within the institutionalized New Thought, I do think that we have a tendency, even though we don't have dogma and doctrine, but there is a tendency to kind of edge ourselves out of the greater conversation. And I think that, within our movements, we can certainly say, oh, I don't really see it that way. I mean, I say that a lot because I've just been in New Thought for so long that there are things that I hear and I'm like, I'm glad that's working for you, So, but I do want to quote the reason why, and it's actually in your little booklets too, but I want to quote what Charles Fillmore said about the name Unity. So he said, we have studied many isms, many cults, people from every religion under the sun that we either belong to them, people claim from every religion under the sun, that we either belong to them or have borrowed the best parts of their teaching from them. We have borrowed the best parts from all religions. That's the reason why we call it Unity. And I find that very interesting because I think that Unity sometimes has a challenge in terms of what their identity is. And I'm talking about the Unity movement as a whole. I think that there are certainly parts of Unity that want to be very Christian, and then there are parts of Unity that are very metaphysical, and there's this constant, and I don't necessarily think that tension is negative, because it can open the door for a lot more conversations. I'm not a Christian, but I feel very comfortable here at Unity. And then we have a lot of people here at Unity that are Christians, and I think I think it's wonderful to have a space where that can happen. So, yeah. Let's see. Does anybody have a comment or question to that?
No idea. So one of the things I think probably many of us have experienced is when people hear Unity or hear that you go to Unity, I think people tend to put us in a box just like they think of other churches, because most churches have an agenda towards a certain belief system. Mm-hmm. And so I think it is sometimes a great opportunity to educate people, because a lot of times people think, where you're just going to believe in that belief system. Mm-hmm. But because it's different that we're interfaith, that we have so many different acceptance of whoever you are. Like someone yesterday said, well, to me, I can't quite get around the Unity way. And I said, there is no way. Right. It's what's good for your spiritual way. And I think that a lot of times is easy for people to stereotype Unity in general when it's really about, like you say, evolving you to come to find your path. Mm-hmm. That's, I think if I can get this right, religion tells you what to think, and spirituality teaches you how to think. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, and so when we're talking about religious movements, the foundation of religious movements can develop in different ways. For example, there's biblicism, which is the foundation using the Bible as this is the ultimate truth. And then there's traditionalism, where we've just always done this way, and so we have to trust this. And there's hierarchy, that we have this hierarchy of leadership, and that's where our truth comes from. So, and then there's mysticism, and that's where we land here at Unity. Is our tradition is truth comes through experience. Truth comes from within you. The truth is within you. What we would say, or the Bible would say, is the Holy Spirit. You will get your truth from the Holy Spirit, which is inside of you. And we do have, principles. We have the 5 principles, and we do have things like that. But that's the one unique thing about Unity versus, we look even around our city and we have other organizations and other churches. Each, there are many different foundations of truth in a lot of institutions. Ours, we just tend toward mysticism because Charles Fillmore was a mystic. We believe that God was speaking to him. So now we could easily fall into seeing Charles Fillmore's text, what he wrote down as our foundation, then we'd move into biblicism. But we're not there yet. So I don't think we're going there either. But yeah. So any other comments or questions? Go ahead.
In the book, Spirits in Rebellion, the history of New Thought in America or whatever, they talk about him leaving institutions and then coming back if they would change their bylaws.
Right.
And most of the time, it was to change their bylaws for biblical foundations.
Right.
But the paradox is that his interpretation of biblical foundation is different than Orthodox Christianity's interpretation. And so you get this weird configuration.
Yeah.
And so they would put that in there and then they'd take it out and he'd draw. So it was interesting to see that because it's such a paradox because he looked at it different than
You would think.
Well, and a lot of Charles Fillmore's reinterpretations of the Bible, because I have the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary. I've read through a lot of it. I've taken all of the Metaphysical Bible classes that are offered through the SE classes, and a lot of them are just using Eastern mindset to reinterpret the Semitic texts. I mean, that's really what's going on. And so, to me, when I think it's cool. Like, yeah, if that speaks to you, that's wonderful. But it's like, to me, having studied from a critical historical perspective the Bible, so we're taking an ancient text from a culture that written in a language. So we're taking it, we're removing it from the original language, we're removing it from the culture. Already, and we're just talking about biblicism. We're not even going into this metaphysical interpretation, and then then we're reinterpreting it for metaphysics. And again, I don't think it's wrong, but I also think it is so far removed from the original text. And then you have to remember that in between all of that, it was translated from Hebrew. Well, it was the spoken language was Aramaic, then it was written in Hebrew, then it was translated into Latin, and then from the Latin we translated it into English. And then from the English, Charles Fillmore created the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary. So go ahead. And then we're gonna finish up on that. So go ahead.
I just wanted to comment on there's a lot of different religions, and there's also a lot of different types of people, and the separation that's caused and created by not accepting something and handpicking, things. You can handpick whatever works for your life, but the truth is, everyone's truth is their truth, and it is true.
Right.
It has truth to it. So follow what goes good with you and accept that others are following that goes good with them, and then there's not a conversation of disunity. It's accepting all.
Right. No, I 100% agree, and I think that's one of the nice things about particularly our congregation is that we have such a diverse group here.
Yeah.
I mean, we have Buddhists here, and we have Christians here, and we have people like me where I don't even really know where I land. Like I just appreciate.
Right.
I appreciate learning just whatever is in front of me. So. Oh, Clay, and then we're going to finish up. So
I just have a brief comment about, speaking of hand picking, it's been empirically proven through research, through verified, vetted research, that things like tithing and other aspects, I can't name any other ones besides that, but that's one of the biggest ones, have been added to the text by church leadership in order for their own self-aggrandizement. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to add that.
Oh yeah, sure.
The Council of Trent figured it all out anyway.
All right, so we're going to finish up. We have announcements, but I did want to say one other thing, that we are New Thought. So where the New Thought movement goes, or where, we're the ones who are kind of steering the ship now. So I did want to say that. And then next week, I'm going to be doing How to Love Yourself. You can skip that announcement. And we're going to be talking about modern New Thought and the history of Louise Hay, and that's going to start that series, and that'll be 2 weeks. So go ahead with the announcements.
Well, that's not what it says you're teaching.
Yeah. What does it say?
Technique.
So that's interesting. So I did send an email to the office a few weeks ago.
Yeah, it's
so
this one now.
It's this now.
I just put it in the pre-service.
Thank you. I'll go update the slides.
No, Bobby has that, or just go to that.
Beginners and Intermediate West African Drum class is Monday at 7 p.m., open to everyone. The first month of lessons is free. Carrie Kugler's Spirit Group will not meet this Thursday, the 27th. Mark your calendar for movie night, April 28th, 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. Childcare is not provided. Popcorn, water, coffee provided by our host, Bobby Delmar. Please RSVP to let him know how many seats to set up. Bring snacks and your choice of beverage. Movie to be shown in the fellowship hall. Start your day with stillness and peace at Silent Sunrise. We welcome all who seek a moment of quiet contemplation, regardless of faith or background.
Starting in May.
Beginning May 1st, join us Monday through Friday from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m., excluding holidays, and feel the power of collective prayer. Submit your prayer requests online to be included in our daily intentions. The Spring Fashion Boutique is Friday, May 5th from 5:30 to 8 p.m. and Saturday, May 6th from 8:30 to 11 a.m. Ladies, please sort your gently used spring-summer clothing and donate what you are willing to part with for this event. The items must be clean, no stains, no tears, or missing buttons. Purchases are on a love offering basis. Sunday, May 7th is our monthly potluck and our quarterly town hall meeting. You are invited to celebrate Women of Strength at our mother-daughter banquet May 12th. Feel free to invite a woman who has been like a daughter or like a mother to you. Ladies, be looking for your childhood photos. This is going to be fun. Save the date. Denise Rosier will be here in concert June 24th.
Oh my gosh.
And that's it. Yay. Thank you.
Good.